I am Claire Morgan, 36 years old. The day my husband's accident changed everything was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet in a way that felt wrong, as if the world itself had paused to hold its breath. Before that morning, my life had followed a careful rhythm: breakfast with our two children before school, coffee with Ethan before he left for work, a house that smelled faintly of toast and routine. We weren't rich, but we were steady. We had built a life on small consistencies: grocery lists, mortgage payments, movie nights, and the comfort of believing that tomorrow would look a lot like today. Ethan worked construction, and that morning he kissed me goodbye with the same casual certainty he always did. By noon, he was in a coma. A steel beam had fallen at the site, crushing everything in its path. I learned this from a voice on the phone that sounded calm, professional, and completely unreal. I don't remember driving to the hospital. I only remember the sterile brightness of the hallway, the mechanical rhythm of machines, and the weight of realizing how fragile ordinary life really is. The hours that followed felt endless. I sat in a plastic chair beside his bed, surrounded by the low hum of hospital equipment, watching the rise and fall of his chest under the thin blanket. There were forms to sign, words I didn't understand: neurological damage, swelling, oxygen levels. But none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that Ethan wasn't waking up. Everything else blurred into white noise. Before the accident, I had believed in the security of family. My mother, Lydia, proud and composed, the kind of woman who wore pearls to dinner. My brother, Connor, always chasing dreams that never seemed to last. And Ethan's parents, who loved to remind everyone of their success. I thought they would be there when we needed them. I thought blood meant something unshakable. I was wrong. The first day passed without a call. The second, without a visit. On the third, I realized the silence wasn't temporary, it was deliberate. The same people who once filled our home with laughter now vanished when reality became inconvenient. I told myself they were processing, that they needed time. But as days became weeks, the truth settled like dust after a storm. They weren't coming. If you're watching this, please hit the like button. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and sharing your own experiences helps remind people like me that we're not alone. The hospital began to feel like its own world, sealed off from everything outside. The smell of antiseptic replaced the scent of home. I learned to sleep in chairs, to eat from vending machines, to measure time by the nurses' rotations. When I left at night, the cold Vermont air bit through my coat, the darkness stretching endlessly between the hospital parking lot and the empty house waiting at the end of it. Every sound felt magnified: the refrigerator hum, the creak of floorboards, the echo of a life that used to feel safe. In the quiet, I began noticing the first cracks that had always been there, but never visible. My mother's messages were polite, but distant, carefully avoiding words like help. My brother's social posts showed ski trips and wine tastings, while I rationed savings for hospital bills. And Ethan's parents, who once insisted we were family first, quietly began asking about joint accounts and paperwork. The timing wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. Looking back, I can see the moment I changed. It wasn't when I heard about the accident, or when I signed the first medical form. It was when I understood that the people I had trusted to hold me upright were already stepping back to watch me fall. Something inside me broke, but another part hardened in its place. I became the one who would not look away, who would not beg, who would not forget. That was the beginning of the real story, not the accident, not the silence. But the slow realization that sometimes tragedy doesn't destroy families, it reveals what they were all along. And once you see that truth, There's no going back. The first week after Ethan's accident felt like an endless loop of sterile hallways, medical updates, and waiting. I began to understand that hospitals operate in a kind of suspended time. There is no day or night, only the rhythm of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes on polished floors. Every morning, I arrived before sunrise, and every evening, I left long after dark, carrying with me the same mixture of dread and hollow hope. At first, I still believed people would come. I kept checking my phone for messages that never arrived, glancing toward the door as if someone might appear, remorseful and ready to help. But the hours passed, and no one did. I started to recognize the pattern. Family that sends thoughts and prayers, but never gas money. Relatives who asked for updates, but never offer solutions. My mother's messages became less frequent, her tone more detached. My brother's life online looked brighter than ever. It was as though my suffering existed in another language they refused to learn. I learned to live in fragments. Hospital visits, insurance calls, and the nightly drive home through snow-covered streets became the framework of my existence. The house, once warm with the smell of Ethan's cooking, had grown colder. I stopped turning on most of the lights. It felt wrong to fill the rooms with brightness when the person who brought life to them lay motionless in a hospital bed. Each night, I walked through our bedroom and stared at the half-folded laundry on his side of the bed, exactly as he had left it. I couldn't bring myself to move it. It became proof that a part of him still existed in the world beyond the hospital. In some strange way, I began to measure hope by how long I could keep things untouched. Days became indistinguishable. I moved mechanically, responding to calls, signing documents, approving tests, pretending to understand medical terms that blurred together. The financial pressure tightened like a noose. Insurance didn't cover everything. The small savings we had built together evaporated faster than I thought possible. Every payment felt like a wound reopening. Another reminder that survival had a price tag. I started noticing small inconsistencies in our accounts. Numbers that didn't add up. Balances lower than they should have been. At first, I dismissed it as my own exhaustion, the mistakes of a tired mind. But deep down, something whispered that this was more than miscalculation. I ignored it because I couldn't bear to face another betrayal. Not yet. Instead, I focused on Ethan's progress. The doctor said his body was strong, that sometimes recovery took time. I clung to those words like scripture. I watched his chest rise and fall, and convinced myself that meant he was still fighting. I told myself that the silence around me was temporary, that once he woke up, everything would start to mend. The finances, the distance, the isolation. But with each passing day, that illusion grew thinner. The hospital became my whole world. I learned to recognize every nurse by the sound of their footsteps, every shift change by the tone of the announcements. I stopped checking the calendar because time had lost meaning. The outside world continued its routine, but mine had narrowed to one goal: keeping him alive long enough to return home. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the hospital glass and didn't recognize myself. My eyes looked older, my posture heavier. I had stopped wearing makeup, stopped brushing my hair some mornings. It was strange to realize that while Ethan slept, I was slowly disappearing beside him. I started avoiding people who asked how I was doing. There was no honest answer that didn't make them uncomfortable. So I told no one how I'd begun counting hours by the beeping of machines, how I no longer feared bad news because it had become constant. I stopped waiting for comfort and began adapting to its absence. What surprised me most wasn't the loneliness, it was the clarity. The absence of noise stripped everything down to its truth. I saw my family differently now, their absence forming a kind of mirror. They had always relied on my reliability, on my willingness to fix what they broke. Without Ethan's steady presence, they saw an opening, a fracture they could use. When the first bills for long-term care arrived, I sat in the hospital cafeteria, staring at the numbers until they stopped making sense. I felt detached from my own life, as though I were reading about a stranger's misfortune. And maybe that's what grief does. It pushes you so far outside yourself that you start watching your life from a distance. It was in that moment, sitting beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, that I realized help wasn't coming. Not from family, not from friends who vanished into polite distance. The safety net I thought existed beneath me had never been real. I had built it from assumption and habit, not from truth. That night, I drove home in silence, snow falling thick across the windshield. The world outside looked untouched, pure, unbroken. Inside me, something shifted quietly, permanently. I stopped waiting to be saved. I began preparing to survive. The morning I found out what had really been happening didn't begin with a sign or a warning. It began with routine. I had learned to live inside patterns because they gave the illusion of stability. Wake up before dawn, pack the children's lunches, check the hospital updates, drive through the same stretch of frozen road to sit beside Ethan for hours. The world outside that routine no longer felt real. But that morning, something pulled me out of it. An email alert flashing across my phone as I was leaving the house. It was from the bank, a transaction notice. The amount was large enough to make my breath catch. At first, I assumed it was an error. The hospital bills had been unpredictable, but this one was labeled differently. It wasn't medical. It was a transfer, sent to an account I recognized but couldn't immediately place. When I checked again, my stomach tightened. It was under my father-in-law's name. The word authorization glared back at me from the screen, and for a few seconds, I simply stared at it, my hand frozen above the phone. I didn't want it to be true. I didn't want to believe that even now, as Ethan lay unconscious, someone was quietly siphoning away what we had left. By the time I arrived at the hospital, the world around me felt distant, almost muted. I moved through the motions, checking in, washing my hands, sitting at his bedside, but everything inside me had shifted. I watched the faint rise and fall of Ethan's chest, the gentle pulse of the monitor beside him, and felt an unfamiliar mix of love and fury. Love for the man who had built this life with me, and fury for those dismantling it while he couldn't speak. The idea that family would steal from family while tragedy unfolded had always belonged to other people's stories, not mine. Yet there it was, laid bare in numbers and dates. I had never felt betrayal so sharp. It wasn't the money itself, though that loss was staggering. It was the intent behind it, the deliberate cruelty of taking advantage of someone's silence. It was realizing that the people who should have been holding me upright were standing on the foundation of what they'd stolen. As I sat there, I began to connect the missing pieces I'd ignored. The small withdrawals I dismissed as billing errors. The sudden defensiveness in my mother's brief messages. The way Ethan's parents had grown distant whenever I mentioned finances. None of it was random. They had been quietly emptying what we built, using Ethan's accident as a distraction, trusting that I would be too overwhelmed to notice. That afternoon, I drove home in a kind of trance. The sky hung low and gray, and the trees along the road looked skeletal against the snow. When I reached the house, I turned off the engine and sat in silence, watching my reflection fade in the car window. The person staring back at me didn't look like the woman I used to be. She looked harder, older, hollowed out by exhaustion and disbelief. Inside, the house was colder than usual. The heating bill had gone unpaid for 2 weeks because I was waiting for a transfer that never came. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, opening every account we owned. The numbers told the story better than words ever could. Withdrawals every few days, labeled as reimbursements, travel expenses, charitable contributions. The amounts varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. More than $30,000 had vanished in a matter of weeks. I stayed there until sunrise, scrolling through statements until the lines blurred together. The soft blue light of morning crept across the kitchen floor, illuminating the stack of unpaid bills beside me. Somewhere between exhaustion and clarity, I realized that what had been taken wasn't just money. It was safety. It was trust. It was the last illusion that family would do the right thing when it mattered. The next few days passed in a fog of grim efficiency. I gathered paperwork, printed statements, and saved copies to a drive, as though archiving the remains of a life that no longer existed. Every number became a piece of evidence, every date a reminder that kindness had limits. I began moving through the world with a kind of numb precision, stripped of everything sentimental. I still visited Ethan every day, but something inside me had changed. I stopped speaking to anyone about hope. I no longer pretended we were surrounded by support. When the nurses smiled politely, I smiled back, but it felt like a reflex instead of a choice. I was operating from instinct now, the kind that surfaces when the world proves itself unsafe. The hardest part wasn't the theft itself. It was understanding what it revealed about the people I had loved. My parents had raised me to believe that loyalty meant endurance, that family bonds were permanent, no matter how strained. Ethan's parents had built their entire identity around the idea of unity and pride. Yet beneath those polished surfaces was something hollow. What I found in those bank statements wasn't just greed, it was indifference. They didn't care what their actions meant for us. They didn't care that their son's future hung in balance. In the following week, I began noticing how calm I had become. There were no tears left to cry, no anger sharp enough to pierce what was now solid resolve. I began planning quietly, small steps toward independence, the first moves of someone preparing for a war she never wanted to fight. Every night, I went to bed with the same thought repeating in my head: this ends with me. I didn't know what form that ending would take, or how much I would have to lose before I reached it. But I knew that I could no longer wait for anyone else to do what was right. The truth had stripped me bare, and what remained was something unrecognizable but unbreakable. That was the day I stopped being the person who believed family would save me. That was the day I became the person who would save myself. I began to move through life as if I were both participant and witness, watching myself from somewhere just outside the frame. Every action felt mechanical, every choice deliberate. I no longer waited for answers or apologies. There was nothing left to explain. The evidence sat printed in a folder inside my bag, pages of transactions, withdrawals, and signatures that told the full story of betrayal. I carried it everywhere, as if keeping it close could prevent further damage. As if proof could somehow protect me. The days grew shorter, but time itself seemed to stretch endlessly. Winter had settled in for good, coating everything in silence. The drive to the hospital each morning became a kind of meditation. The rhythmic pattern of tires over frozen roads, the breath of fog against the windshield, the stillness of small towns barely awake. I counted landmarks the way other people counted prayers, each stoplight and gas station a marker that I was still here, still moving, still enduring. Inside the hospital, the air always smelled faintly of disinfectant and faint hope. Ethan's room had become an extension of myself. I could trace every sound, every flicker of light on the monitor by instinct. There were moments when I imagined he could sense me there, that somehow through the haze of machines and medication, he knew I hadn't left. But that thought was dangerous, because hope was dangerous. Hope made me vulnerable to the people waiting to use it against me. Bills continued to arrive in neat white envelopes, their edges sharp enough to cut. I stacked them carefully, pretending the pile was manageable, even as it grew into a small monument of pressure. I had always believed that careful planning could shield us from chaos. Savings, insurance, emergency funds, each layer builds on logic and foresight. But what I had never prepared for was theft disguised as love. I had safeguarded against the unpredictable, not against the familiar. At night, I would sit at the kitchen table, the only light coming from the small lamp beside me. The house around me felt both mine and not mine, a museum of what we once were. Ethan's jacket still hung by the door. His boots, still dusted with the last remnants of work, waited beside it. I couldn't bring myself to move them. They were artifacts now. Proof of a life interrupted mid-sentence. I stopped calling my mother altogether. There was nothing left to say. Her silence was louder than any words she might have offered. My brother's messages had shifted from concern to irritation, subtle reminders of debts he claimed to remember only now. Ethan's parents maintained their performance of grief in public, while in private, they continued to drain the remnants of our savings. I began to understand that grief in their hands was just another currency to spend. My body started to mirror my mind. Tired, brittle, always on edge. Meals became optional. Sleep was something I experienced in fragments, short bursts of restless half-awareness between the sounds of the house settling and the wind scraping against the windows. Some nights, I woke with my heart pounding, convinced I had heard footsteps downstairs. Each time, I would sit at the edge of the bed, staring into the darkness until I could breathe again. Fear had made itself at home inside me. It was in those sleepless hours that I began to calculate. I went over every account, every number, building scenarios in my mind. I thought of what it would take to start over completely, to close every shared link, every door that connected me to the people who had turned my tragedy into opportunity. It was not about revenge. It was about reclamation, about pulling back the pieces of myself that had been taken slowly, deliberately, under the guise of family obligation. The turning point came quietly, the way most defining moments do. It wasn't a scream or a confrontation. It was the sound of my own voice inside my head, steady and final. Enough. That word settled into me with the weight of truth. Enough of waiting for decency from people who had none. Enough of pretending to be fragile so that others could feel strong. Enough of letting guilt disguise itself as loyalty. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. I moved through the house with a calm that felt almost unnatural. I gathered every piece of documentation, every receipt, every bank statement. I placed them in order, not as preparation for a fight, but as a map, evidence of how far I had come and what I had endured. The act of organizing them became ritual. It was a reclamation of control, the first step towards something that belonged entirely to me. At the hospital, I sat beside Ethan and watched the faint flicker of his eyelids beneath the dim light. The sound of the monitor had become the rhythm of my existence. Each steady beep felt like a heartbeat outside of time, marking both survival and delay. I wanted to tell him that I had found my strength again, that the world we built was still here in fragments, waiting for him. But I knew that words would only echo back to me, unanswered. So I let silence speak instead. As the day faded, snow began to fall outside the window. Slow, deliberate, endless. The sky looked heavy enough to collapse under its own weight. I sat there until the nurses dimmed the lights for the evening. The room bathed in a soft amber glow. Something inside me shifted then. Not dramatically, but irrevocably. I realized that survival isn't a single decision. It's a collection of them, made quietly in the moments when no one is watching. When I finally drove home, the road was empty. The world looked untouched, freshly covered in white, as if everything that had happened could be buried beneath it. But the truth remained. I couldn't erase what had been done to us. I couldn't unsee the betrayal written in numbers and silence. What I could do, however, was begin again, not as the person who had lost everything, but as the one who had finally stopped pretending she hadn't. That night, I stood in the doorway of our home, the cold air brushing against my face. The quiet no longer frightened me. It felt honest. I understood then that breaking wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of who I was always meant to become. In the days that followed my decision, life rearranged itself into something unfamiliar but sharper. The fog that had dulled everything began to lift, leaving behind a reality stripped of illusion. I had spent months existing in survival mode, suspended between fear and responsibility. Now, there was only clarity. The chaos had not disappeared, but it had form. It had edges I could finally see and touch. I began my mornings with deliberate stillness. Before the sun rose, I would stand at the kitchen window, watching frost creep across the glass, tracing its fragile veins like a map of everything I had endured. The house remained silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the heating pipes. There was a new kind of peace in that silence, one that came not from comfort, but from acceptance. I no longer waited for calls or messages. The silence of those who had betrayed me had stopped feeling like abandonment and started feeling like freedom. At the hospital, the nurses had started to greet me with a kind of quiet respect. They must have sensed the change. Grief had worn me down, but it had also carved something resilient in its place. I moved differently now, steadier, more certain. I no longer asked questions whose answers would only hurt. I had learned that peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the decision to stop letting pain have the final word. Ethan's condition remained the same, stable but unmoving. There were days when the machines felt like the only heartbeat left in our lives. I sat by his side and read the same pages of old novels over and over, not to fill the air, but to remind myself that words still existed, that meaning still had a place, even when hope did not. I no longer cried in that room. The tears had dried up somewhere along the line, replaced by something quieter, heavier, and far more enduring. Back home, I started rebuilding in small, almost invisible ways. I closed joint accounts, redirected bills, changed passwords. Each action felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been scattered among people who didn't deserve it. There was something therapeutic in the paperwork, something grounding about numbers and limes that obeyed rules when people did not. The mailbox became a daily reminder of the life I had left behind. Every envelope bore evidence of the old world, insurance forms, statements, hospital letters. But they no longer filled me with dread. Instead, they became tasks, small challenges to be conquered one by one. I began to measure time not in days or weeks, but in completions. Each form submitted, each balance corrected, each piece of order restored was a victory, no matter how small. Occasionally, I would catch myself remembering what it felt like to be part of a family. The illusion of closeness that had once felt so secure. Those memories didn't hurt the way they used to. They had softened into something distant, almost abstract. The people who had betrayed me were no longer the villains in my story. They were simply part of its landscape. the necessary shadows that made the light more visible. I didn't reach out to them. There was no need. The absence spoke for itself. They had built their comfort on the foundation of my pain, and now that foundation was gone. I sometimes wondered if they even realized what they had lost. Probably not. People like that rarely do. The neighbors had stopped asking questions. They must have sensed the unspoken boundary that now surrounded my life. I moved through the world like someone who had crossed a line that others couldn't see. There was a different kind of power in solitude, one that didn't need to be explained. Winter deepened, and the landscape outside the hospital window changed color. The once bright snow turned gray, heavy with the residue of long months. I began to crave sunlight the way others craved rest. But even in that grayness, there were moments of quiet beauty. Sometimes when I arrived early in the morning, the first light would spill across the sterile floor tiles, illuminating the corridor like a small promise. Those moments reminded me that life continues to move, even when it feels frozen. I started keeping a notebook, a record of what I was learning, though I never called it that. I wrote about resilience, about the strange calm that comes when everything collapses and you realize you're still standing. I wrote about the exhaustion that feels like both defeat and rebirth. Some pages were filled with nothing but fragmented thoughts, half sentences, single words. Strength, boundaries, enough. The notebook became my witness. A place where I didn't have to justify anything. There were still bad days, of course. Days when exhaustion wrapped around me like a fog. When the sound of a hospital monitor could unravel me from the inside. But even on those days, I could feel something inside me rebuilding. It was slow and uneven, like scar tissue forming over an old wound. Healing, I learned, isn't graceful. It's messy and raw, and often invisible, until one day you realize you're not bleeding anymore. By late winter, I had made peace with the idea that Ethan might never wake up. It wasn't resignation, it was understanding. His body was fighting its own battle, and I could no longer carry the weight of both. Letting go of control didn't mean letting go of love. It meant releasing the illusion that love alone could fix everything. That realization was both painful and liberating. The day I noticed the first sign of spring, I was standing outside the hospital entrance. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth, and a single bird sat perched on the railing, its feathers puffed against the cold. It felt like a quiet acknowledgement, a reminder that seasons change, whether we're ready or not. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the cold air, realizing that I had survived the darkest part of the storm. What came next was unknown, but it no longer frightened me. I had been broken open and remade in the same winter. I had learned to exist without safety nets, without guarantees, without the comfort of illusion. The people who left had taught me the cost of misplaced faith. The ones who remained, Ethan, the nurses, the silent few who showed up without expectation, reminded me that not all love demands something in return. I wasn't the same woman who had once believed that tragedy could bring people together. I had learned that sometimes it does the opposite. It strips everything away until all that's left is truth. And standing in that truth, even when it's cold and merciless, is still better than living inside a beautiful lie. There comes a point in grief when stillness begins to change shape. What once felt like paralysis begins to resemble control. It doesn't happen suddenly. It unfolds gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one morning you realize the air feels lighter. That was how it began for me. The slow return of motion, the reawakening after too long in the dark. By late March, the snow outside the hospital had started to melt into dull rivers that carried away the residue of winter. The parking lot, once buried under white silence, had become a mosaic of gray puddles and falling mud. I noticed the details because I needed proof that things still changed. For months, every day had looked the same. Now, even the smallest signs of transformation felt monumental. I had become fluent in routine, the early drives, the hospital corridors, the quiet rituals of care that had come to define my existence. But beneath that routine, something was stirring. The exhaustion that had once clung to me like a second skin had begun to fade, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to resolve. I wasn't healed. I wasn't at peace. But I was awake again. My visits to Ethan's bedside were no longer filled with questions or silent bargaining. I had stopped pleading with the universe. I had stopped asking why. The need for answers had dissolved into a quieter understanding. Some things simply exist beyond explanation. The man I loved was still there, suspended in time, his presence both comforting and devastating. I learned to sit in that duality without collapsing beneath it. At home, the rhythm of life had shifted. The house no longer felt haunted. It had become something else, a refuge, stripped of pretense. I stopped moving around it like a visitor and began to reclaim it room by room. I threw out what I didn't need, not in a burst of anger, but as an act of quiet release. Old photographs went into boxes. Clothes I hadn't worn in years disappeared into donation bags. The clutter of a former life made space for something cleaner, emptier, and more honest. In the evenings, I worked on a side project that had started as distraction and slowly evolved into purpose. I had begun gathering notes, articles, and resources for families blindsided by medical crises, guides about managing finances, navigating insurance, and recognizing the subtle forms of exploitation that often appear when people are most vulnerable. It wasn't an organization yet, only an idea, but it was mine. It gave shape to the pain, transforming it from something senseless into something that might someday help someone else. Each small step forward was matched by moments of backward pull. There were mornings when the weight of uncertainty felt unbearable, days when a simple sound, the beep of an elevator, the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, could drag me back to the first night of the accident. I learned to let those moments pass without fighting them. Grief, I realized, doesn't move in a straight line. It loops and folds back on itself, unpredictable and relentless. The world outside my own had continued without pause. My family remained absent, their silence a kind of confession louder than words. The betrayal that had once consumed me no longer burned. It smoldered quietly in the background, reduced to ash and understanding. I no longer needed apologies. I no longer wanted them. Distance had become its own justice. There were, however, new presences that filled the space they left behind. The nurses who greeted me with genuine warmth. The quiet nods of recognition from other families in the ward. The strangers who held open doors without knowing how much such small kindness mattered. Life had a way of placing gentle hands where cruel ones had let go. The kindness of strangers became the scaffolding I built my days around. One afternoon, I noticed that Ethan's hand no longer felt as cold when I held it. The doctors spoke in measured tones about stability and minor improvements, but I had stopped attaching hope to statistics. Instead, I let small details carry their own meaning. The faint warmth of his skin, the rhythm of his breathing, the way his pulse aligned with my own. Whether he returned to me or not, that connection was real. It was enough. I had changed in ways that no one could see. My reflection showed the evidence. Lines etched deeper around my eyes, a certain weariness that time might never erase. But the deeper transformation lived somewhere inside. I had become pragmatic with my emotions, learning to hold grief and gratitude in the same breath. I had learned to live without expectation, to find steadiness in uncertainty. When the first flowers appeared on the trees lining the hospital walkway, I stood outside longer than usual. The air was still cold, but it carried a softness I hadn't felt in months. The world was quietly thawing, and so was I. I thought of everything that had been taken, everything that had fallen apart, and realized that survival had transformed me into someone unrecognizable to my former self. There was no going back, but there was forward, and that was enough. I no longer feared solitude. It had become a kind of companion, a space where truth could finally breathe. The silence that had once terrified me now felt sacred. Within it, I could hear my own heartbeat again. I began to trust it, to follow it wherever it led. In the stillness of that early spring, I understood that the turning tide wasn't about sudden redemption or miraculous change. It was about endurance, the quiet strength of continuing, even when the world no longer offered reassurance. Healing didn't arrive like light breaking through clouds. It crept in slowly, disguised as routine, disguised as one more sunrise, one more drive, one more heartbeat beside the hospital bed. The tide was turning. Not because life had restored what I lost, but because I no longer defined myself by loss. The woman who once begged for rescue had learned to rescue herself. The one who waited for justice had found peace instead. The one who measured her worth by others' loyalty had discovered that solitude, when chosen, could be its own form of freedom. And as the days grew longer and the world began to bloom again, I knew that something irreversible had taken place. I had crossed the quiet threshold between surviving and living. The storm had not ended. It had simply taught me how to stand in the rain without drowning. Time had started to feel elastic, stretching and folding in on itself. I could no longer measure life in days or weeks. Instead, I measured it in small changes. The way sunlight lingered a little longer on the hospital floor. The way the shadows shifted around Ethan's bed. The way the air outside began to carry the scent of rain instead of snow. Spring had taken hold in quiet defiance of everything I'd endured. The world outside was moving forward, renewing itself, while I still hovered in the in-between. I existed in a narrow corridor between life and waiting, between what was and what might still be. The distance between myself and the rest of the world grew wider with every sunrise. People laughed, worked, planned vacations, and spoke about the future as if it were guaranteed. I listened to their words, but could no longer relate to them. My sense of time was built around one heartbeat, the one I listened to through the steady rhythm of a hospital machine. Ethan's condition remained unchanged, though the doctors used softer words now, words like plateau and stability. They spoke as though this stillness was something to be grateful for, as if motionless survival was a kind of progress. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I had learned to mistrust words that tried to make suffering sound noble. Stability didn't feel like safety. It felt like limbo. I had stopped expecting miracles. I had also stopped fearing their absence. My life had narrowed to essentials: breathing, enduring, showing up. Each morning I entered that room, I became both caretaker and witness, watching the person I loved suspended between existence and memory. I no longer tried to fill the silence. I simply let it be. Outside the hospital, the world shimmered with new life. Trees wore the pale green of beginning again, and the sound of birds returned to the mornings. I began walking after my visits, tracing the paths around the hospital gardens. It became a kind of meditation, one foot in front of the other, the rhythm steady and grounding. Sometimes I passed families laughing together on benches or children feeding ducks by the pond. Their voices felt distant, like echoes from another lifetime. Yet there was comfort in the reminder that joy still existed somewhere, even if it wasn't mine. At home, the transformation continued in small, imperceptible ways. I began rearranging the living room, moving furniture away from where it had always been. It wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was survival. Change, no matter how small, was proof that I could still make decisions, that the world hadn't stopped entirely. Each shift in space felt like reclaiming oxygen. I started to keep a quiet record of everything: the bills, the letters, the hospital updates, even the thoughts I didn't say out loud. Pages of my notebook filled with fragments, single sentences that didn't always make sense, but felt necessary to write. Still here. Breathe. Don't forget who you are. Those words became anchors. There were nights when I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the empty side that still carried the shape of him. The sheets no longer smelled like his cologne, only of absence. But I had stopped trying to erase it. Grief wasn't something to fix. It was something to live with, to learn from, to grow around. I no longer wanted to escape it. I wanted to understand it. A betrayal that had shattered my trust months earlier had faded into something else, no longer sharp, but heavy and quiet. I had accepted that apologies would never come. They belonged to a different world, a world where people took responsibility for what they destroyed. I had built a new life without them, one built on boundaries instead of blind loyalty. The distance between us wasn't only physical, it was moral, it was spiritual. And though part of me mourned the family I'd lost, a larger part felt relief that I no longer owed them the comfort of my forgiveness. Still, there were moments when the loneliness cut deeper than I expected. Watching other families support each other through tragedy felt like observing a language I used to speak, but had forgotten. I envied the simplicity of belonging. I envied those who didn't have to be strong alone. But even envy has limits. In time, I learned that solitude, though brutal, had refined me. It stripped me bare, but it also made me clean. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, I stood outside watching the horizon fade from gold to gray. The air felt different, thicker somehow, like the pause before a storm. There was no reason for the unease that settled in my chest, but I had learned to trust my instincts. Something was shifting. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't the light. It was something else, an invisible current beneath the surface of my calm. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the soft creaks that used to comfort me, now filled with tension. My thoughts returned to the hospital, to Ethan, to the faint flickers in his monitors that marked his stillness. I thought of how everything in my life now balanced on that fragile rhythm, how my days depended on the persistence of that sound. The thought terrified me, but I couldn't look away from it. I realized then that distance wasn't only what separated me from others. It was what separated me from the life I had known, from the version of myself that believed pain had limits, that believed endings were clean. What stretched before me now was not an ending, but a long horizon of uncertainty. And somewhere on that horizon, something was coming. I could feel it. It was not dread exactly, but a knowing. The air itself seemed to hum with it, as though life was preparing to turn again, to test what I had built from the ruins. I didn't know if it would bring healing or another collapse. I only knew that the tide of stillness was about to break. If you've stayed with me this far, ye can probably feel it too, the quiet tension, the wait before the next chapter of this story unfolds. Something is coming, and everything I thought was settled is about to shift again. Stay with me. Subscribe, so you'll be here when it happens, because what comes next will change everything. The morning it happened began like any other, muted, gray, and heavy with routine. There was no warning, no premonition, no sign that the day would rearrange everything I thought I understood. The sky hung low, a dull sheet of cloud pressing against the world, and the air carried the faint chill of late spring rain. I woke before the alarm, as I always did, my body conditioned by months of repetition. The silence inside the house was absolute, almost sacred. It was the kind of silence that feels like holding your breath before a storm. By then, I had stopped thinking in terms of normal and abnormal. Life was simply divided into before and after. Before the accident, after the silence. The woman I had been before, careful, trusting, endlessly accommodating, no longer existed. What remained was something leaner, quieter, shaped by endurance. I had built walls around my life so solid that nothing unexpected could reach me. Or so I believed. When I arrived at the hospital, the corridors were already humming with quiet activity. Nurses moved with practiced precision, their expressions calm, detached, and kind. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. I walked the same path I had walked 100 times, past the vending machines, past the waiting area where I no longer waited, toward the room that had become both a sanctuary and a cage. Each step was familiar, rehearsed, automatic. I wasn't prepared for what was waiting inside. At first, I didn't notice the difference. The lights were dim, the machines steady, the quiet, rhythmic beeping unchanged. It was only when I reached the bedside that I saw it. Small, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Ethan's hand, resting on the blanket, had moved, just slightly, but enough to catch the light differently. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination, another trick of exhaustion. But then it happened again, the faintest twitch, the smallest flecks of fingers, a tremor that rippled through the air like a whisper. I didn't move. I couldn't. My breath caught somewhere between disbelief and terror. The room felt suspended. Time stretched thin around me. The monitors continued their calm rhythm, oblivious to the upheaval they had just framed. I stared at his hand until my vision blurred, until the sterile white of the sheets dissolved into light. The months of waiting, of preparing for a life without him, collided violently with the fragile possibility that he was still here, still fighting to surface. I don't remember how long I stood there. Minutes, maybe hours. I didn't need confirmation, didn't need words or explanations. The movement had been real. It had been enough. Something had shifted, not just in his body, but in mine. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt the sharp edge of hope cut through the numbness. Hope is a dangerous thing when you've taught yourself to live without it. It doesn't arrive gently. It claws its way back in, drags you from the safety of surrender, and forces you to feel everything you had buried. I had spent months making peace with stillness, finding balance in acceptance, but that single movement shattered the fragile equilibrium I had built. Suddenly, there was possibility again, and with it came fear, because if life could return, so could loss. The hours that followed passed in fragments. I stayed by his side, my gaze fixed on his face, searching for more signs. His eyelids trembled once, barely noticeable. His breathing changed, slower, deeper, as though the body was remembering itself. The medical team came and went, their movements efficient, their expressions careful. They spoke in terms of neurological response and motor function. But I no longer needed translation. I could see it. He was returning, piece by piece, from the borderland where I had thought I'd lost him. That night, I didn't go home. I sat in that chair beside him long after the corridors went quiet. the glow from the machines painting the room in soft, sterile light. Every sound seemed amplified: the hum of electricity, the distant hiss of air conditioning, the faint pulse beneath his skin when I touched his wrist. I stayed there until dawn, watching him breathe, half afraid to blink in case the world reverted to silence again. By morning, exhaustion had wrapped itself around me, but beneath it was something unfamiliar. It wasn't relief, it wasn't joy. It was something deeper, heavier, the weight of everything that awakening would mean. His return, even partial, didn't erase the months of abandonment or the fractures left by betrayal. If he woke fully, he would wake into a different world. The life we had built was gone, dismantled by people who had once called themselves family. He would have to learn the new geography of what remained, and so would I. In the following days, the doctors called it progress. They used careful optimism, measured by charts and scans. His reflexes strengthened, his grip tightened faintly around objects, his breathing patterns stabilized. The world around us began to respond to his awakening. Nurses checking more frequently, specialists adjusting treatments, schedules shifting to accommodate recovery instead of maintenance. The stillness that had defined our days was replaced by motion, by a quiet hum of activity that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I started noticing how the light changed in the room each morning, how it fell across his face, how it revealed colors I hadn't seen in months. I began to feel things I didn't know how to name: gratitude, fear, disbelief, and something almost like grief. Because even in this miracle, there was loss. The life that would return to me would not be the same one that had been taken. He would not be the same man, and I would not be the same woman. Recovery, I realized, is its own kind of mourning, the slow process of saying goodbye to who you were before the breaking. Outside the hospital, spring had fully arrived. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. I began to walk with lighter steps, but the unease lingered beneath the surface. Every time the monitors beeped irregularly, my heart lurched. Every time I left the hospital, I looked back, half expecting the fragile miracle to dissolve behind me. Hope had returned, but so had vigilance. At home, I could feel the old ghost stirring. The unopened letters, the unanswered calls, the memories of betrayal that no amount of time could bury. I knew that news of Ethan's recovery would spread, and with it, the people who had vanished would find reasons to reappear. Their concern would return, carefully wrapped in apologies and explanations, dressed as love, but smelling faintly of guilt. I would have to face them again. The tide had turned, just as I had felt it would. But I had learned enough to know that not every return is a redemption. Some are simply the beginning of a new reckoning. And this one, I sensed, would demand more of me than the silence ever had. The story wasn't ending. It was shifting. The stillness had broken, and the waves were rising again. What comes next will decide everything: what survives, what falls apart, and who I become in the aftermath of awakening. In the weeks that followed Ethan's awakening, the air around me seemed to hum with anticipation. Life, once muted and predictable, began to move again, but its motion was uneven, unpredictable, almost threatening. After so long inside the stillness of grief, I found myself disoriented by the rhythm of change. I had forgotten what it felt like for time to move forward, for days to have momentum. Hope had returned, but it was not gentle. It arrived with sharp edges, demanding that I face everything I had buried beneath endurance. Ethan's progress was slow, deliberate, measured by tiny increments. The doctors spoke in cautious optimism, tracking each movement, each sign of awareness. His body remembered before his mind did, and I watched, powerless, as fragments of the man I loved began to surface like wreckage rising from deep water. His eyes opened briefly, unfocused and distant, as if the world he was returning to was not the one he had left. The truth, of course, was that it wasn't. A hospital had become my second home, And yet it began to feel foreign again. The nurses who once pitied me now smiled when they passed, their glances soft with encouragement. Their warmth should have comforted me, but it didn't. It only reminded me how fragile this new phase was. The grief of absence had been heavy, but it had rules. This new hope was unpredictable. It demanded energy, patience, strength. It left no space for rest. At night, I drove home through streets washed clean by early summer rain. The world outside glowed with renewal. Gardens were green again. People sat on porches with glasses of wine, laughing into the dusk. The sound of their laughter followed me through the car windows, distant but piercing. I envied their ease, their certainty that the future would cooperate. I had once lived inside that illusion. Now I knew better. The future was not something to trust, it was something to endure. Inside the house, the air had changed. It no longer felt hollow, but it wasn't yet alive. It was waiting, suspended between two versions of reality, the one where Ethan never came home, and the one where he might. His presence lingered in the quiet corners of each room, but it was no longer the presence of memory. It was anticipation, heavy and restless. I began to move differently through the space, tidying rooms I had ignored for months. Opening windows to let in air that smelled like rain and soil. It felt like preparation for something I couldn't name. The calls began soon after. Unknown numbers at first, then familiar ones I had chosen to forget. I didn't answer any of them. Their messages arrived anyway. Curated concern, thinly disguised curiosity, the kind of reaching out that expects to be praised for its timing. They spoke of family, of unity, of forgiveness. I could read the real words behind the practiced sympathy. He's alive and we can return to pretending. But I had no interest in pretense anymore. The reckoning I had been postponing was no longer optional. One afternoon, I drove to the storage facility where I had placed the remnants of our shared life, the boxes of photographs, the files, the records of what had been taken. The air inside smelled of dust and concrete. I opened the first box and began sorting through its contents. Each document, each picture, felt like a fragment of a life that had belonged to someone else. The woman smiling in those photographs was gone. The family surrounding her had been hollowed out by their own greed. But the act of confronting it, of touching what remained, grounded me. It reminded me of what I had survived. As I turned over one photograph, I realized how much of my healing had depended on silence. In silence, I had learned to endure. In silence, I had rebuilt my boundaries. But reckoning, I knew, required sound. It required acknowledgement. For the first time since the accident, I let myself imagine the moment of confrontation, the inevitable collision between the truth I carried and the denial they lived in. I didn't crave revenge. What I wanted was exposure. I wanted them to see the wreckage they had created and call it by its name. Days at the hospital began to stretch longer as Ethan's awareness deepened. His body grew stronger, his responses sharper. The machines that had once dictated our days now served as quiet witnesses to recovery. There were moments when his gaze lingered, when his eyes seemed to recognize the world around him. I could see it, the flicker of confusion, the faint question forming somewhere behind his stillness. I wasn't ready for that question. I wasn't ready for the day he would remember everything. The accident, the silence, the theft, the absence. The truth of what had happened to us. My mind began to drift toward what his awakening would mean for them, the people who had stolen from us while pretending to mourn. I imagined their fear when they realized the narrative they had built would begin to crumble. They had counted on his silence as protection, on his absence as permission. But the silence was ending. He was returning, And with him came the truth they had tried to bury under pretense. The reckoning wouldn't be loud. It would not happen in shouted words or confrontations. It would happen quietly, as all real reckonings do, in the moments when pretense can no longer hold its shape. I would not need to accuse them. My existence, my endurance, his survival would be the evidence they could not escape. There were nights when I thought about forgiveness, about whether it was something I could offer without erasing myself in the process. The answer came softly but firmly. No. Forgiveness without accountability is just another form of submission. What I owed myself, after everything, was not forgiveness, but closure. The kind that doesn't require anyone else's participation. Summer arrived fully, painting the world in bright light and long days. The city felt louder, fuller. But I remained detached from its rhythm. My life existed in smaller scales, in heartbeats, in breaths, in the daily proof of endurance. Ethan's recovery continued, slow but steady, and with every passing day, I felt the distance between us shrinking. But the distance between myself and the past widened until it became unbridgeable. One evening, as I stood outside the hospital watching the sun bleed into the horizon, I realized the reckoning wasn't something waiting ahead of me. It was already happening, quietly, invisibly, in every moment I refused to go back. Each breath was defiance. Each step forward was justice. The world had tried to take everything from me. My husband, my security, my faith in family. But it had failed to take the one thing I never knew I had until I lost everything else. Myself. The reckoning, I understood, wasn't about vengeance or punishment. It was about truth. About standing in it, no matter how cold or lonely that truth might be. And as I turned away from the setting sun, I knew I had crossed another invisible threshold. The past was behind me, but its shadows would still follow. The difference now was that I no longer ran from them. I walked through them, unflinching, ready for whatever the light would reveal next. The end did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly, like the last breath of a long winter, quiet and inevitable. I had imagined closure as something decisive, a moment of release, a clear boundary between what had been and what would come next. But life rarely offers clean endings. It fades, it softens, it unravels. The final silence began not with loss, but with understanding. Ethan's recovery continued through the warm stretch of summer, each day adding a little more strength to his body, a little more focus to his eyes. Yet something about his return felt fragile, almost spectral, as though he existed half in this world and half in the one he had nearly crossed into. Watching him heal was both a miracle and a mirror. The more his body recovered, the more I became aware of what had changed inside me. The woman who had once built her life around others was gone. In her place stood someone quieter, steadier, unyielding in ways I never expected to be. The hospital, once a place of dread, became a monument to transformation. I knew every sound by heart, the whisper of wheels on linoleum, the hum of machines, the faint echo of announcements over the intercom. Those sounds had been my companions through the worst and the waiting. And now, they would be the soundtrack to departure. The doctors began to speak about discharge plans, therapy schedules, home adjustments. Their words mark the end of something that had defined my existence for too long. When I walked through the hospital garden one last time, the air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and blooming lilies. I traced the path I had walked every morning, each step filled with memory. This place had witnessed my collapse and my rebirth. It had seen me as both the mourner and the survivor. Leaving it felt like stepping out of a cocoon, raw and uncertain. Back home, the rooms felt foreign again, even though I had lived inside their silence for months. Everything had been rearranged, not just physically, but spiritually. The house no longer belonged to the person I used to be, and neither did the life waiting inside it. The photographs on the wall, once symbols of love and permanence, had become relics of a time I no longer trusted. I had kept them for him, believing they might anchor his recovery. Now they only reminded me that nothing stays the same, not even love. Ethan's presence filled the house differently than before. His movements were slower, his voice quieter, but there was a depth to him that hadn't existed before the accident. I could feel the distance between us, not hostility, not fear, but the quiet awareness that we were both strangers to the lives we once lived. He was relearning how to exist, and I was learning how to exist without disappearing inside someone else's story. We shared space, but each of us was walking our own invisible path towards something undefined. In the quiet hours of the night, I often sat by the window, listening to the faint rhythm of his breathing from the next room. It was steady, deliberate, reassuring. Yet every inhale and exhale reminded me how fragile this new beginning truly was. I had fought for his life, but in doing so, I had sacrificed a version of myself that would never return. That realization didn't bring sadness anymore, only clarity. Survival always demands a trade. The people who had betrayed us resurfaced in small, predictable ways. Letters arrived first, carefully worded apologies, wrapped in nostalgia and denial. Then came the gestures, messages, voicemails, unexpected packages left at the door. Each one carried the same false promise of reconciliation. I didn't respond. Silence had become my form of truth, my refusal to rewrite history for anyone else's comfort. Their guilt no longer belonged to me. The reckoning I had waited for had already happened, not in confrontation, but in the quiet persistence of my peace. There was no satisfaction in their remorse, only distance. The boundaries I had built were not walls. They were borders of identity, lines I had drawn to protect the small, sacred life I had rebuilt from ruin. As summer began to fade, I found myself returning to the places that had once anchored me. The pier near the hospital, where I used to watch the sunrise. The small cafe that stayed open late for night shift workers. The road leading home, lined with trees that had once been bare and now shimmered with early hints of gold. Each place carried echoes of pain, but the echoes no longer hurt. They were simply reminders that I had survived every version of myself that came before. There was a day in early autumn when the air turned crisp and the first leaves began to fall. I remember standing outside, watching them drift slowly to the ground, and realizing that I no longer needed to hold on to everything. Grief had taught me that control is an illusion. Letting go wasn't failure. It was the final act of faith. Faith that what remained was enough. Faith that peace didn't require perfection. The silence that settled over my life in those weeks felt different from the one that had followed the accident. This was not the silence of despair. It was the silence of completion. A stillness that asked for nothing, demanded nothing. I had spent so long trying to make meaning out of chaos, but meaning had arrived on its own, quietly, without ceremony. It lived in the space between breaths, in the light that shifted across the floor, in the knowledge that I had rebuilt a life from ashes and made it mine. Ethan's recovery continued in slow, steady increments. There were good days and difficult ones. There were moments when fear returned like an old visitor, testing the boundaries of my strength. But I met it differently now. I didn't fight it. I let it pass through me, knowing it would leave as quietly as it came. A final silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was the absence of resistance. It was the moment I stopped reaching backward, stopped searching for the life I had lost. The story of what happened to us no longer felt like tragedy. It had become something else, a testament to endurance, to the quiet, persistent power of becoming. Sometimes I wonder who I might have been if none of it had happened. But the question doesn't hold weight anymore. The woman I am now wouldn't trade her hard-earned peace for the safety of her former ignorance. The scars are not reminders of suffering. They are proof of transformation. And so the story ends, not with noise or finality, but with breath, with the quiet rhythm of a life that continues. The storm has passed. The house stands. The heart, though marked by its fractures, beats steadily. The final silence is not emptiness. It is truth. It is the sound of what remains after everything else has fallen away.